Layla Harris was no ordinary woman. As an experienced DEA agent, she had spent years perfecting the art of blending into any environment, whether it was a suburban neighborhood, a bustling city, or the underbelly of crime-ridden zones. She had seen the worst of humanity and fought tirelessly to dismantle dangerous cartels that left countless lives in ruin. Layla wasn't just skilled, she was relentless. Yet, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, never revealing the depth of her abilities unless the situation demanded it. For her, it wasn't just a job, it was a mission, a calling to make a difference in a world where justice often felt like an abstract ideal. Today, she was deep undercover, her latest assignment pushing her into the heart of an international operation involving the trafficking of both drugs and illegal firearms. It was a sprawling network that spanned borders, pulling in players from some of the most ruthless cartels across the globe. For weeks, Layla had been infiltrating one of the smaller cells of this operation, gaining their trust and positioning herself as a valuable asset. She had created a persona hardened, no-nonsense freelance operative with a reputation for getting things done discreetly and effectively. It wasn't an easy role to play, but Layla excelled at deception. Every word, every movement was calculated, designed to keep her cover intact. Her assignment had brought her to a remote, desolate area outside the city, a collection of run-down buildings on the outskirts of a forgotten industrial district. The location was ideal for the criminals she was investigating, secluded, shadowed by decay, and far from prying eyes. Layla had received word from her DEA handlers that a critical meeting was to take place here. She was tasked with delivering a suitcase supposedly filled with counterfeit cash, a gesture of good faith meant to secure a larger deal. The stakes were high. This operation was the culmination of months of preparation. If it went smoothly, Layla would gather evidence that could lead to the cartel's dismantlement. If it didn't, well, she preferred not to dwell on that possibility. Arriving early, Layla parked her nondescript sedan a block away, careful not to draw attention. The air was thick with humidity, and the dimming evening light painted the abandoned buildings in hues of rust and shadow. She exited the car, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans, her hair tied back into a loose bun. Her appearance was deliberately unremarkable, designed to deflect attention. She carried the suitcase with ease, though she was acutely aware of the weight of the situation it symbolized. Her movements were measured, her senses on high alert as she approached the designated building. Inside, Layla quickly assessed her surroundings. The place was a husk of its former self, cracked walls, peeling paint, and graffiti-stained windows. Debris littered the floor, and the faint scent of mold hung in the air. It was the kind of place no one would willingly visit, the perfect backdrop for clandestine dealings. Layla found a corner near an old support beam, her vantage point chosen to give her a clear view of the entrance. She set the suitcase down carefully, her other hand resting near her concealed firearm. Despite the grim setting, her mind was sharp, running through contingency plans in case anything went wrong. What Layla didn't know was that her presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Officer Derek Rains, a local cop with a history of overstepping his bounds, had been patrolling the area. Rains wasn't here on official business. He had a habit of prowling neighborhoods he deemed trouble spots, often relying more on his own prejudices than actual evidence. To him, the sight of a black woman walking into an abandoned building with a suitcase in hand was all the justification he needed to act. He didn't stop to consider the context or ask himself why she might be there. His mind had already constructed a narrative. She was either a drug dealer, a courier, or someone up to no good. It was all the excuse he needed to involve himself, even though it was far beyond the scope of his duties. From his patrol car, Rains watched Layla disappear into the building. His pulse quickened as a familiar thrill coursed through him. He thrived on the rush of confrontation, on asserting his authority in situations he deemed suspicious. The fact that no one had called in a complaint didn't matter to him. He was a man who followed his instincts, and those instincts were often clouded by racial bias. Tonight was no exception. As Layla continued her surveillance, completely unaware of the officer's presence, Rains parked his car a short distance away. He stepped out, adjusting his belt and resting one hand on the holster of his gun. His posture was rigid, exuding the kind of false confidence that masked insecurity. He approached the building with heavy steps, his boots crunching against the gravel. His movements weren't subtle. He wasn't trying to sneak up on anyone. Rains wanted to be seen, to make his authority known before he even opened his mouth. Inside, Layla heard the footsteps before she saw him. Her instincts flared, her body tensing as she shifted her position to stay out of sight. She didn't expect company, and the timing was too coincidental to ignore. Peering around the edge of the support beam, she caught sight of Rains as he entered the building. He scanned the area, his expression a mixture of suspicion and misplaced bravado. Layla didn't recognize him, but his demeanor spoke volumes. He wasn't part of the operation. He didn't have the look of someone used to this kind of danger. No, he was something else entirely, and whatever his intentions, they were bound to complicate her mission. Rains's voice cut through the silence, sharp and commanding. "Who's in here? Come out where I can see you." Layla remained still, her mind racing. This wasn't part of the plan. If Rains blew her cover, the entire operation could fall apart. Worse, the criminals she was targeting might retaliate, and innocent lives could be at risk. She needed to think fast. Slowly, she reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over a button that would send a discreet alert to her DEA team. It wasn't time to call for backup yet, but she wanted to be ready. Rains took another step forward, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the suitcase. His suspicions deepened, and he tightened his grip on his holstered weapon. I said, "Show yourself." He barked, his tone laced with impatience. Layla knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped out from behind the beam, her hands visible at her sides. "What's this about, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Rains's eyes flicked to her, scanning her appearance with thinly veiled judgment. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "This is private property, and you've got no business being here." Layla met his gaze evenly. "I could say the same to you," she replied, "but I'm not looking for trouble." Her measured tone seemed to agitate him further. Rains wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he already considered suspicious. He took a step closer, his hand now resting on the grip of his gun. "What's in the suitcase?" he demanded. Layla hesitated. Revealing its contents wasn't an option, not to him, not now. "Just some personal belongings," she said, her voice steady. Rains wasn't convinced. His expression hardened, and Layla could see the confrontation escalating. She needed to defuse it, but she also couldn't let him derail her mission. The situation was spiraling, and the night was only beginning. The tension in the air was palpable as Layla maintained her composure, staring down Officer Rains, whose hand lingered on the grip of his holstered gun. His posture radiated the kind of authority that demanded submission, but Layla wasn't the type to back down. She could feel her pulse quicken as her instincts warned her that this man was not going to let the situation de-escalate easily. Every move she made from this point forward would need to be calculated, deliberate. Any misstep could jeopardize not just her operation, but potentially her life. Rains wasn't here to listen nor to understand. He was here to assert control over a situation he didn't fully comprehend. driven by assumptions that fueled his determination to treat Layla as a suspect. "I asked you a question," he barked, taking another step closer, his boots crunching against the scattered debris on the floor. "What's in the suitcase?" Layla took a measured breath, her mind racing through potential responses. She couldn't give him the truth; it would blow her cover and put her at risk of exposure to the cartel she'd spent weeks infiltrating. But lying outright wasn't an option either. Someone like Rains would only see that as a challenge to his authority. Instead, she opted for a calm, neutral approach. "Just personal items," she replied, her voice steady, almost disarming. "Nothing you need to worry about." But Rains wasn't one to let things go. Her calmness seemed to only irritate him further, as though her refusal to show fear was a personal affront. He stepped closer, now only a few feet away, his gaze narrowing as he studied her face. "Personal items? Out here in a place like this? Doesn't seem like the kind of spot for personal items, now does it?" His tone was laced with condescension, each word dripping with a presumption of guilt. "Why don't you open it up and show me?" Layla's hand twitched instinctively toward the suitcase, but she stopped herself. She knew the moment she opened it, the operation would be compromised. The suitcase contained counterfeit cash, a key piece of evidence meant to lure the cartel into completing their deal. If Rain saw it, there would be no way to explain it without revealing her role as an undercover DEA agent. She needed to stall, to buy time and figure out a way to turn the situation in her favor. "I don't think that's necessary, officer," Layla said calmly, though the steel in her voice was unmistakable. "I'm not doing anything illegal, and I'm not obligated to show you what's in my suitcase without a warrant." Rains's jaw tightened at her words. It was clear he wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Layla. His grip on his holster tightened, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but out here you don't get to make the rules. I'm telling you to open the damn suitcase, and I'm not asking again." Layla could feel the situation spiraling. She needed to think fast. A direct confrontation would only escalate things, and while she was confident in her ability to defend herself, she couldn't risk drawing unnecessary attention to the scene. Not yet. The cartel's eyes and ears could be anywhere, and any sign of trouble could alert them to her true identity. She decided to shift tactics, hoping to redirect Rains's focus without giving him what he wanted. "I get it," she said, her tone softening slightly. "You're just doing your job. But this isn't what it looks like. I can explain." "Don't," Rains interrupted, raising a hand to cut her off. His eyes burned with suspicion as he gestured toward the suitcase. "I don't care what kind of story you're about to spin. You're trespassing on private property with a bag that looks like it's hiding something, and I'm not going to stand here and argue about it. Either you open that suitcase right now, or I'm placing you under arrest." Layla's patience was wearing thin. She'd spent her career dealing with situations far more dangerous than this, facing down cartel enforcers and criminals who would kill without hesitation. Yet here she was being cornered by a cop whose ego and assumptions were about to ruin everything. Her mind raced as she considered her options. She could comply and hope to regain control of the situation later, or she could make a move now and risk escalating the confrontation. Neither option was ideal, but she didn't have the luxury of time to deliberate. Before she could respond, Rains reached forward, grabbing the suitcase and pulling it toward him. "Enough games," he muttered, his voice low and menacing. "Let's see what you're hiding." Layla's heart pounded as she stepped forward instinctively, her hand brushing against the handle of the suitcase. "Wait," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You don't want to do that." Rains froze, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment there was silence between them, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy in the air. Layla could see the flicker of doubt in his expression, the briefest hesitation as he processed her words. But it wasn't enough to stop him. His determination to assert control over the situation was too strong. "Oh, I think I do," he said, a smug smile creeping across his face. He yanked the suitcase open, exposing its contents, stacks of counterfeit bills neatly arranged, their crisp edges catching the dim light of the room. Rains's eyes widened in surprise, but his expression quickly shifted to one of triumph. Well, what do we have here?" Layla clenched her fists, her mind racing as she prepared for what would come next. Rains had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and now she had to find a way to salvage the operation. "It's not what it looks like," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Rains let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not what it looks like. Lady, you're carrying a bag full of fake cash in the middle of nowhere. I don't think there's much room for interpretation." "You don't understand," Layla said, taking a step closer. "That money isn't." "Save it," Rains snapped, cutting her off again. He reached for the radio on his shoulder, his other hand still hovering near his gun. "We're going to settle this downtown. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Layla didn't move. She couldn't let him take her in knot with the operation hanging by a thread. Her team was counting on her, and the evidence she carried was crucial to dismantling the cartel. She needed to act, and she needed to act fast. "I'm warning you," she said, her voice low and measured. "You're making a mistake." "Turn around," Rains repeated, his voice rising with impatience. "Now." Layla weighed her options one last time before making her decision. With a swift, practiced motion, she stepped forward, grabbing the suitcase and slamming it shut. The sudden movement caught Rains off guard, and she used the moment to pivot, putting distance between them. Her training took over, her body moving on instinct as she prepared for what was to come. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, sharpening her senses and heightening her awareness of every detail around her. Rains recovered quickly, his face twisting with anger as he drew his gun and leveled it at her. "I said turn around," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty building. Layla didn't flinch. Her mind was already 2 steps ahead, calculating her next move. She knew she couldn't win this confrontation by force alone, but she also couldn't afford to let Rains take control. She needed to outthink him, to use his arrogance and assumptions against him. The standoff had begun, and the stakes had never been higher. Layla's body was a coiled spring of tension as she stared down the barrel of Derek Rains's gun. The officer's eyes were wild with the adrenaline of perceived control, but his movements betrayed uncertainty. He was angry, sure, but Layla could see the flicker of hesitation, the subtle tremble in his grip. He was in over his head, and deep down, he probably knew it. But that didn't make him any less dangerous. If anything, it made him more so. An unpredictable man with a weapon was a disaster waiting to happen. The silence between them stretched taut, broken only by the faint hum of distant traffic outside the abandoned building. Layla held her hands slightly away from her sides, her stance neutral but ready. She wasn't going to make any sudden moves, not yet. Every second she kept him talking, every moment she delayed, increased the chances of her team arriving in time to neutralize the situation. But even as she tried to buy herself a lifeline, she knew she couldn't rely on external help. Not here. Not now. She had to take control. "Turn around and get on your knees." Rains barked again, the pitch of his voice higher now, betraying his fraying confidence. He waved the gun for emphasis, as though the motion alone could compel her compliance. Layla didn't move. "You're not listening to me. Officer Rains," she said, her voice calm and steady, like a parent trying to reason with a tantrum-throwing child. You don't know what you've just walked into. This isn't about you, and it's not about me. But if you keep pushing, you're going to make things worse. Not just for yourself, for everyone." Rains laughed sharply, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, that's rich. You're standing here with a suitcase full of fake cash in the middle of a known trafficking zone, and you're trying to tell me I'm the problem. Lady, I've heard it all before." "I'm not your enemy," Layla said, her tone measured, but her patience was wearing thin. "And if you weren't so busy playing cowboy, you might realize that." The words hit their mark. Rains's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring as he took a step closer. "You've got a real attitude problem, you know that. I don't care who you think you are or how clever you think you're being. You're under arrest. Now, are you going to cooperate, or am I going to have to force you?" Layla's eyes flicked to the side, quickly scanning the room for anything she could use to her advantage. The beam she had hidden behind earlier was sturdy and close enough to provide cover if she needed it. The suitcase, though heavy, could serve as a distraction if thrown. And then there was Rains himself, a man so blinded by his own assumptions that he'd already underestimated her. She filed the observations away, her mind working at a breakneck pace to construct a plan. But before she could act, Rains made his move. With a swift motion, he reached into his belt and pulled out a pair of zip ties. "Hands behind your back. Now," he ordered, his voice sharp, the barrel of his gun still trained on her. Layla considered her options. Fighting him now would escalate things too quickly, and she couldn't afford for the situation to spiral out of control before her team had a chance to respond. Forcing herself to remain calm, she slowly turned and placed her hands behind her back, feeling the cold bite of the zip ties as Rain secured them tightly around her wrists. The plastic cut into her skin, but she didn't flinch. Pain was something she could handle. Losing control of the situation was not. "There we go," Rain said, his tone smug as he holstered his gun and stepped back to inspect his work. "Now we're getting somewhere." Layla flexed her fingers experimentally, testing the give of the ties. They were tight but not unbreakable. With the right leverage, she could snap them, though doing so would require precision and timing. For now, she needed to keep Rains distracted. "Congratulations," she said dryly. "You've just detained an innocent woman. What's your next move? Parade me through the station and hope no one asks why you're arresting someone without probable cause?" Rains scowled, but her words seemed to land. He hesitated, glancing at the suitcase as though seeking validation for his actions. "You're far from innocent," he said, but the conviction in his voice had weakened. "People like you don't just show up in places like this without a reason." "People like me?" Layla repeated, arching an eyebrow. "Careful, Officer Rains. You're starting to sound like a man who lets his prejudices do the thinking for him." "Don't twist my words," Rains snapped, his face flushing. "You don't know anything about me." "Maybe not," Layla conceded. "But I know enough to see you're out of your depth." The jab struck home. Rains's expression darkened, and he stepped closer, towering over her. "You think you're smart, don't you? Think you've got it all figured out? Well, let me tell you something. Out here, I'm the one in charge. Not you. Not anyone else. Me." Layla met his gaze, unflinching. "If you were half as smart as you think you are, you'd realize that kind of thinking gets people killed." For a moment, it seemed like Rains might explode. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and the vein in his temple pulsed visibly. But before he could respond, the sound of a distant car engine cut through the tension. Both of them froze, their attention snapping to the doorway as the unmistakable hum of tires on gravel grew louder. Rains's head whipped back toward Layla, his eyes narrowing. "Who's that?" "Your guess is as good as mine," Layla said evenly. though inwardly her mind was racing. The cartel. It had to be. They were early. Her team hadn't had time to secure the perimeter, and now the operation was at risk of unraveling entirely. Rains moved toward the doorway, peering out cautiously as a black SUV rolled to a stop outside. The windows were tinted, the license plate obscured, and the vehicle radiated an air of menace. "Stay here," he barked, though the order was more for his own reassurance than hers. As he stepped outside, Layla worked quickly. Shifting her weight, she twisted her wrists against the zip ties, feeling the plastic strain under the pressure. It was a delicate balance. Too much force too soon would snap the ties prematurely, leaving her exposed. She needed to time it perfectly. Outside, Rains approached the SUV, his hand once again hovering near his gun. The driver's side window rolled down slowly, revealing a man with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. "Can I help you?" Rains asked, his voice carrying an edge of bravado that didn't quite mask his unease. The man in the SUV didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, revealing a second figure in the passenger seat, one whose presence made Layla's blood run cold. It was Javier Torres, the cartel's second in command and one of the most dangerous men she'd ever encountered. Layla's mind raced. If Torres was here, the stakes had just risen exponentially. Rains didn't know it, but he was standing inches away from a man who wouldn't hesitate to kill him if he thought it necessary. And if Torres suspected for even a moment that Layla wasn't who she claimed to be, the consequences would be catastrophic. Inside the building, Layla felt the zip ties give way with a soft snap. She flexed her wrists, wincing as circulation returned to her hands, but there was no time to dwell on the discomfort. She needed to act fast. Without making a sound, she retrieved the knife concealed in her boot, her movements swift and practiced. If she timed it right, she could neutralize Rains and secure her position before Torres made his next move. But as she crept toward the doorway, she couldn't shake the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of the night's chaos. Rains, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, stood his ground. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice rising. "What are you doing here?" Torres finally spoke, his voice low and laced with menace. "I think the better question, officer, is what are you doing here?" The stage was set, and Layla knew the next few moments would determine everything. The tension outside the abandoned building was suffocating. Layla crouched in the shadows just inside the doorway, watching as Officer Rains confronted the cartel's second-in-command, Javier Torres. The black SUV loomed like a predator in the dark, its tinted windows hiding the full scope of the danger within. Layla's instincts screamed at her to act, but the situation was teetering on the edge of chaos, and any sudden move could tip it into catastrophe. Rains stood stiffly in front of the vehicle, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. His bravado was clearly faltering under Torres's steely gaze. Layla could see the beads of sweat forming on the officer's forehead, the slight tremor in his fingers as he tried to maintain the appearance of control. But this was a game Rains wasn't equipped to play. Torres exuded a calm, calculated menace, the kind that came from years of commanding loyalty through fear. He wasn't intimidated by Rains's badge or his bluster. To Torres, Rains was an annoyance, a minor obstacle in his way. Torres leaned casually against the doorframe of the SUV, his sharp features illuminated by the dim glow of the interior light. "You've got a lot of nerve, officer," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge that promised violence. "Walking into a place like this, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Rains straightened his posture, trying to project authority, but the crack in his confidence was unmistakable. "This is my jurisdiction," he shot back, his voice uneven. You're the one who needs to explain why you're here." Layla couldn't help but wince at Raines's bravado. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Every word out of his mouth only dug him deeper into a hole he wouldn't be able to climb out of. And yet, part of her couldn't help but admire his stubbornness, misguided as it was. She needed to intervene, but not yet. She had to wait for the right moment. Torres smirked, exchanging a glance with the man in the passenger seat. "Your jurisdiction," he repeated mockingly. "Funny. I didn't realize this part of town was under your personal protection. But if that's the case, maybe you can help us. We're looking for someone. A woman. Maybe you've seen her." Raines hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "What woman?" Torres's smirk widened. Dark skin, athletic build, probably carrying a suitcase. Sound familiar? Layla's stomach dropped. Torres was onto her. He didn't know exactly who she was yet, but he had enough pieces of the puzzle to make her a target. If Raines gave her up now, everything would fall apart. Her cover would be blown, the operation compromised, and Raines wouldn't survive the night. Raines's eyes flicked toward the building for a fraction of a second, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but one that didn't escape Torres's notice. Layla saw the cartel leader's expression harden, his casual demeanor slipping away like a mask. He stepped out of the SUV, his movements slow and deliberate, and took a step closer to Raines. "I'll ask you again," Torres said, his voice colder now. "Have you seen her?" Layla knew she couldn't wait any longer. If Torres pushed Raines too far, the officer might crack and give her up, even unintentionally. She needed to take control of the situation, but she couldn't do it alone. She reached for her concealed earpiece, which had been silent since Raines's arrival, and activated it with a tap. "This is Layla," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need backup. Now?" There was a brief pause. Then the calm voice of her handler crackled through the earpiece. "We're moving in, but we're still 5 minutes out. Hold your position." 5 minutes. Layla's mind raced. 5 minutes was an eternity in a situation like this. She needed to stall, to create a distraction that would buy her enough time for her team to arrive. She glanced around the room, taking in her surroundings with a tactical eye. Her gaze landed on a stack of rusted metal pipes leaning against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was something. She moved quickly, silently positioning herself behind the doorway. With a calculated shove, she pushed the pipes over, sending them clattering to the ground with a deafening crash. The noise echoed through the building and out into the night, drawing the attention of everyone outside. What the hell was that? One of Torres's men muttered, his hand moving to the weapon at his side. Torres held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes were locked on the doorway, his sharp gaze scanning the shadows. "Looks like we're not alone," he said, a dangerous edge creeping into his tone. Raines turned to look as well, his earlier bravado now replaced with genuine fear. "Who's in there?" he demanded, taking a step back toward his patrol car. His hand was on his gun, but it was clear he didn't trust himself to use it. Torres didn't answer. He gestured to the man in the passenger seat, who stepped out of the SUV and moved toward the building with a slow, predatory gait. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the brim of his baseball cap. In his hands, he carried a shotgun, the barrel glinting in the faint moonlight. Layla's pulse quickened as she watched him approach. She had to act fast. Her team was still minutes away, and if Torres's men found her before they arrived, she'd have no chance of maintaining her cover or her life. She reached for the knife hidden in her boot, the familiar weight of the blade grounding her as she prepared to strike. The man with the shotgun stepped through the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. Layla pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow and controlled. She waited until he was close enough to see the glint of her blade, then lunged forward, driving the knife into the soft flesh of his arm. He let out a grunt of pain, the shotgun clattering to the ground as he staggered back. Layla didn't give him a chance to recover. She delivered a swift kick to his knee, sending him crashing to the floor, then grabbed the shotgun and leveled it at the doorway. Outside, Torres and his men reacted instantly. 2 more emerged from the SUV, their weapons drawn, while Torres barked orders in Spanish. Rains, caught in the middle, looked like a deer in headlights. He fumbled for his radio, his hands shaking as he tried to call for backup. "This is Officer Rains," he stammered into the radio. "I need assistance. Suspects are armed and—" Torres's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Shut him up!" One of the cartel enforcers turned and delivered a brutal blow to Rains's stomach, knocking the wind out of him and sending him crumpling to the ground. Layla winced but forced herself to stay focused. She couldn't help Rains now. She needed to keep the cartel distracted long enough for her team to arrive. She stepped out of the building, the shotgun raised, and locked eyes with Torres. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the wheels turning in his mind as he sized her up. He didn't know who she was yet, but he knew she wasn't just some random woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. "This ends now," Layla said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Drop your weapons and back away." Torres chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered and outgunned. You really think you can take all of us?" Layla's grip on the shotgun tightened. "Try me." For a moment, the 2 of them stared each other down, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. Then, in the distance, the faint sound of sirens began to grow louder. Layla's team was finally on their way. Torres heard it too. His smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and full of promise. He gestured to his men, and they began retreating to the SUV, keeping their weapons trained on Layla as they moved. Layla didn't lower the shotgun until the vehicle disappeared into the night, the sound of its engine fading into the distance. Only then did she allow herself to exhale, her shoulders slumping as the adrenaline drained from her body. Behind her, Rains groaned as he struggled to his feet, clutching his stomach. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered, his voice weak. Layla didn't answer. She didn't have time to explain. The sirens were drawing closer, and she needed to be ready for the next phase of the operation. The night was far from over. The night's events had escalated into a high-stakes disaster that no one, least of all Layla, could have fully anticipated. The cartel's retreat left a charged silence in its wake, broken only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. The dim light from the abandoned building flickered across the scene, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to mirror the precarious situation. Layla stood motionless, the shotgun still in her hands, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her mind raced with calculations what had just happened, what would happen next, and how she could salvage her mission before it completely fell apart. Officer Rains stumbled to his feet, clutching his stomach and coughing violently. His earlier bravado had been replaced by a mixture of confusion and humiliation. Layla didn't spare him a glance as she scanned the darkened streets for any signs of the cartel doubling back. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Torres was smart and ruthless. Walking away without a plan was not his style. "You care to explain what the hell just happened?" Rains rasped, his voice sharp with pain and indignation. His gaze darted between Layla and the now empty street. "Who the hell were those guys? And who the hell are you?" Layla didn't answer immediately. Her focus remained on the environment around her, every instinct on high alert. "This isn't the time for questions," she said finally, her tone clipped. "Backup is on its way. Stay alert." Rain scoffed, clearly unsatisfied with her response. He took a step closer, his face twisting in frustration. "Stay alert? That's all you've got to say. Lady, I just got my ass handed to me by a bunch of thugs with guns, and you're acting like this is business as usual. What the hell is going on here?" Layla finally turned to face him, her expression steely. "What's going on," she said evenly, "is that you've made this situation 10 times worse by sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. If you'd listened to me from the start, we wouldn't be in this mess." Rains' eyes narrowed, his pride clearly stung by her words. "Excuse me, I was doing my job. You're the one sneaking around an abandoned building with a suitcase full of counterfeit cash. Don't try to pin this on me." Layla took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Despite the height difference, her presence was commanding, and Rains instinctively took a half step back. "Let me make something clear, officer," she said, her voice low and deadly. "I am not your suspect. I am not your problem. But if you keep getting in my way, you're going to become one. So unless you want to explain to your superiors why you let a major operation fall apart because of your ego, I suggest you stand down and let me handle this." For a moment, Rain seemed at a loss for words. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself, clearly realizing he was in over his head. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest and scowled. "Fine," he muttered, "but I'm not going anywhere." Layla didn't have time to deal with his stubbornness. The sirens were growing louder now, the faint red and blue lights reflecting off the broken windows of the building. Her team was finally closing in, but the damage had already been done. Torres and his men were gone, and with them, the counterfeit cash that was supposed to bait the cartel into a larger deal. Worse, Torres had seen her face. He didn't know exactly who she was yet, but it was only a matter of time before he pieced it together. The black SUVs of the DEA convoy screeched to a halt a few feet away, their doors flying open as agents poured out, weapons drawn and movements precise. Layla relaxed slightly as she recognized the lead agent, Marcus, who approached her with a mixture of urgency and concern. "Layla," Marcus said, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. "What the hell happened? We got your signal, but it looks like we missed the party." Layla lowered the shotgun and handed it to one of the agents. "Torres was here," she said bluntly. "He showed up early. We were caught off guard." Marcus frowned, his jaw tightening. "Did they make you?" "Not entirely," Layla replied. "But they're close. Torres knows enough to start asking questions, and we lost the cash." Marcus swore under his breath, running a hand through his short, cropped hair. "That's not good. We needed that money to seal the deal." "I know," Layla said. "But we're not out of options yet. Torres is smart, but he's predictable. He won't walk away from this without getting what he came for." Marcus nodded, already shifting into tactical mode. "All right, we regroup, re-strategize. But we need to move fast. If Torres figures out your DEA..." "He won't," Layla interrupted firmly. "Not if we get to him first." Marcus hesitated, then gestured to the rest of the team. "Secure the perimeter. Sweep the area for any evidence they might have left behind. And someone get me an update on satellite surveillance. I want to know where that SUV went." As the agents dispersed, Layla turned back to Rains, who was watching the scene unfold with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Your DEA," he said, his voice tinged with both accusation and admiration. "You've got to be kidding me." Layla crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Still think you're in charge here?" Rains didn't respond. He seemed to deflate slightly, his earlier bravado replaced by the realization of just how far out of his depth he truly was. But before he could dwell on it, one of the agents called out from inside the building, "Agent Harris, we've got something." Layla and Marcus exchanged a glance before heading inside, Rains trailing behind them. The agent led them to a corner of the room where a small device lay half hidden beneath a pile of debris. Layla crouched down to inspect it, her stomach sinking as she recognized the cartel's signature encryption module. It was a tracking device, likely planted in the suitcase to monitor its location. Torres had known exactly where to find her. "They knew we'd be here," Layla said, her voice grim. "They've been one step ahead of us this whole time." Marcus swore again, pacing back and forth as he processed the implications. "This changes everything," he said. "If Torres has access to this kind of tech, she's got resources we didn't account for. We're going to need to rethink our entire approach." Layla straightened, her mind racing. "We don't have time for that. Torres is already on the move, and if he figures out what we're really up to, we'll lose him for good. We need to act now." Marcus hesitated, clearly torn between caution and urgency. But before he could respond, another agent rushed in, his expression urgent. "We've got a hit on the SUV," he said. "They're headed toward the docks." Layla's heart skipped a beat. The docks were a known hotspot for cartel activity, a labyrinth of shipping containers and warehouses that provided the perfect cover for illicit deals. If Torres was headed there, it meant he was planning something big. "We move now," Layla said decisively, already heading for the door. "We can't let him get away." Marcus nodded, signaling for the team to mobilize. "You heard her. Let's go." As the agents filed out, Layla turned back to Rains, who looked as though he was still trying to process everything that had just happened. "You're coming with us," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Rains blinked. "What? Why?" "Because you're already in this," Layla said. "And because I don't trust you not to screw it up if we leave you behind." Rains opened his mouth to protest, but quickly closed it again, clearly realizing he didn't have much of a choice. With a resigned sigh, he followed Layla out to the waiting vehicles. As the convoy sped toward the docks, Layla's mind was a whirlwind of strategy and uncertainty. The stakes had never been higher, and the margin for error was razor thin. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let Torres win. Not tonight. Not ever. The air at the docks was heavy with the scent of salt water and rust, a damp chill seeping into Layla's skin as she stepped out of the DEA convoy. The area was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of metal containers and the distant sound of water lapping against the pier. The maze of shipping containers stretched in every direction, their towering stacks creating a claustrophobic labyrinth of shadows and blind spots. If Torres was here, he had chosen his battleground well. Layla's team fanned out silently, weapons drawn and eyes scanning every corner for movement. The tension was palpable, the kind that settled into your bones and made your every step feel heavier. Layla led the way, her senses razor sharp as she navigated the uneven ground. She could feel Rains trailing behind her, his presence a mix of reluctance and lingering confusion. He didn't belong here, and both of them knew it, but there was no time to argue. The mission came first. Marcus's voice crackled softly through the earpiece. "We've got heat signatures up ahead, west side near the main warehouse. Looks like 3 vehicles and at least a dozen bodies." Layla nodded, her jaw tightening. "That's Torres. He wouldn't bring this many people unless he was preparing for a fight." "Or a deal," Marcus replied. "They've probably got the real cash with them. If we time this right, we can catch them in the middle of the exchange." Layla glanced at her watch, calculating. Torres wouldn't waste time. He was too paranoid to linger in one place for long. We need to move fast. Take the south entrance and cut off their escape route. I'll lead the team through the east side. Keep comms open. Copy that, Marcus said before his line went silent. Layla turned to the small group following her, their faces grim and focused. We move in quietly, she said. No one fires unless I give the order. Our priority is Torres and securing the evidence. Her eyes landed on Rains, who looked out of place among the armed agents but tried to mask his discomfort. And you, she added sharply, stay behind me. Don't do anything stupid. Rains bristled but nodded, clearly out of his depth and too aware of it to argue. Layla didn't wait for further acknowledgement. She turned and moved forward, her team falling into step behind her. Every step felt deliberate, every breath controlled. The maze of containers loomed around them, the faint glow of light spilling from the warehouse up ahead serving as their beacon. As they neared the target, Layla slowed her pace, raising a hand to signal the team to stop. She crouched low, peering around the edge of a container to get a better view of the scene. What she saw confirmed her suspicions. Torres stood at the center of the warehouse, flanked by his men, their weapons casually visible but not yet raised. Opposite them was another group, local smugglers, by the look of their disorganized appearance. Between them sat a pallet stacked with duffel bags, the unmistakable shape of bundles of cash bulging from within. Layla's heart pounded as she studied the scene. Torres wasn't just here for a deal, he was here to consolidate power. This was a display of dominance, a calculated move to expand his operation. If they didn't act now, Torres would slip through their fingers and disappear into the shadows, stronger and more dangerous than ever. She tapped her earpiece. I have eyes on Torres. He's mid-deal. Marcus, are you in position? South entrance is secure, Marcus replied. We're ready when you are. Layla exhaled slowly. On my signal. She turned to her team, giving a series of hand gestures to relay the plan. The agents nodded, their expressions grim with understanding. They moved into position, surrounding the warehouse from multiple angles, their movements swift and silent. Rain stayed close to Layla, his eyes darting nervously as he tried to process the scale of what was unfolding. Stay here, Layla hissed at him. Do not move until I say so. Before Rains could respond, Layla moved forward, her body low and her weapon raised. She slipped through the shadows, closing the distance to the warehouse with practiced ease. As she reached the entrance, she pressed herself against the wall, her finger hovering over the trigger. She could hear Torres's voice now, calm and commanding, as he negotiated with the smugglers. 5 million, Torres said, his tone even but firm. And not $1 less. You're lucky we're even willing to deal with amateurs like you. The smuggler leader, a wiry man with a scruffy beard, bristled at the insult but didn't argue. You'll get your money, he said grudgingly. But we want assurance this partnership is worth it. We've heard rumors about heat on your end. Torres chuckled, a low, menacing sound. Let me worry about the heat. You just worry about holding up your end of the bargain. Layla's grip tightened on her weapon. She couldn't wait any longer. The deal was moments from being finalized, and every second she delayed increased the risk of Torres slipping away. She tapped her earpiece once, signaling the go-ahead. Move, she whispered. Chaos erupted. The DEA agents stormed the warehouse from all sides, their weapons trained on the cartel and the smugglers. EEA. Drop your weapons and get on the ground. Marcus's voice boomed through the space, shattering the tense negotiations. Torres reacted instantly, drawing his pistol and barking orders to his men. Take cover. Don't let them corner us. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing through the cavernous warehouse. Layla darted forward, her movements precise as she took cover behind a stack of crates. She fired off a shot, forcing one of Torres's men to retreat, then scanned the room for her target. Torres was already moving, weaving through the chaos with practiced ease, his bodyguards covering his escape. Torres is on the move. Layla shouted into her earpiece. I'm going after him. Wait for backup. Marcus called back, but Layla was already in pursuit. She sprinted through the maze of crates and containers, her heart pounding as she closed the gap between herself and Torres. He ducked into a side corridor, and Layla followed without hesitation, her weapon raised and ready. The sound of gunfire faded behind her as she entered the narrow passage, the shadows closing in around her. Give it up, Torres, she shouted, her voice echoing off the walls. There's nowhere left to run. Torres's laughter rang out, cold and mocking. You think this ends here, agent? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Layla pressed forward, her eyes scanning every corner for movement. She knew Torres was dangerous, but she couldn't let fear dictate her actions. She rounded a corner and found him standing at the end of the corridor, his pistol aimed directly at her. You're persistent, I'll give you that, Torres said, his tone almost amused. But persistence only gets you so far. Layla didn't hesitate. She fired a shot, forcing Torres to dive for cover. She advanced quickly, closing the distance as he scrambled to his feet. He fired back, the bullet grazing the wall inches from her head, but she didn't falter. This was what she'd trained for, and she wasn't about to let him win. With a final burst of speed, Layla tackled Torres, sending them both crashing to the ground. His pistol skidded out of reach, and she pinned him down, her weapon pressed to his chest. It's over, she said, her voice cold and unwavering. You're done. Torres glared up at her, his expression defiant despite his defeat. You think taking me down changes anything? He sneered. There's always another man ready to take my place. Maybe, Layla said, but it won't be you. She stood, keeping her weapon trained on him as her team arrived to secure the scene. Marcus gave her a nod of approval, his expression a mix of relief and pride. Nice work, Harris, he said. We got him. But as the adrenaline began to fade, Layla couldn't shake the weight of Torres's words. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served, and Torres's reign of terror had come to an end. The chaos at the docks had subsided, replaced by the hum of DEA vehicles and the low murmur of agents coordinating the cleanup. Layla stood at the edge of the scene, watching as Torres was loaded into a secure van, his wrists bound and his defiance evident, even in defeat. His piercing gaze remained locked on her until the doors slammed shut, the sound echoing through the stillness of the night. For the first time in hours, Layla allowed herself to exhale, the adrenaline slowly draining from her system. But relief was fleeting. The operation had been salvaged, but it wasn't a clean victory. The smugglers had fled during the firefight, and the counterfeit cash, the linchpin of the sting, was gone. Worse, Torres's cryptic parting words lingered in her mind. This wasn't over. Layla knew better than to believe that one arrest, even of someone as significant as Torres, would be enough to dismantle the sprawling cartel he served. The machine would keep moving, gears turning, finding new leaders and new ways to evade justice. Tonight was only a battle, not the war. Marcus approached, his face a mixture of satisfaction and weariness. Torres is secure, he said. We've got enough to keep him locked up for a while, maybe even put a dent in his operation. Layla nodded, though she didn't share his optimism. A while isn't long enough, she said. We need to press him for intel. Find out who's next in line and where they're operating. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. You don't have to tell me that. But you know how this works. Torres is a survivor. He's not going to talk unless he thinks he's got no other choice. Layla's jaw tightened. She had spent too many years chasing shadows, watching men like Torres slip through the cracks because of their ability to manipulate the system. Then we make him think he doesn't. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the conversation. You two done patting yourselves on the back? Rains stepped forward, his expression a volatile mix of anger and embarrassment. His uniform was dirty and torn from the scuffle, and the humiliation of his role in the night's events was written all over his face. Layla turned to him, her patience worn thin. What do you want, Rains? What I want, he snapped, is an explanation. I've been dragged through hell tonight, and I still don't have a damn clue what's going on. Who the hell are you really? And why was I left in the dark? Layla's eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer, her voice low and sharp. You were left in the dark because you don't belong in this world. You nearly ruined an operation that took months to set up because you couldn't keep your ego in check. So maybe instead of demanding answers, you should be thanking us for cleaning up your mess. Rains bristled, his pride clashing with the truth of her words. Cleaning up my mess? You're the one sneaking around with fake money and picking fights with cartels. Don't pin this on me. Enough, Marcus interjected, stepping between them. He turned to Rains, his tone firm. Officer Rains, you are out of your jurisdiction and out of your depth. Be grateful this didn't end worse for you, or for anyone else. Rains opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself, his face twisting with frustration. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, his figure disappearing into the haze of red and blue lights. Marcus shook his head. Think we'll hear from him again? Layla shrugged. Probably. Guys like him don't take humiliation well. But he's not our problem anymore. Marcus nodded, though his expression remained tense. We've got bigger problems to worry about. Torres is just the beginning. His arrest will send shockwaves through the cartel, but it won't stop them. If anything, it might make them more desperate. Layla knew he was right. The cartel's infrastructure was too vast, too deeply entrenched to be taken down by a single operation. Torres was a major player, but there were others waiting to fill the void his arrest would create. The cycle would continue unless they could strike at the roots of the organization. I'll debrief in the morning, Layla said. For now, I need to clear my head. Marcus gave her a knowing look. Don't beat yourself up too much. You did good tonight, Layla. We all did. Layla nodded, though she didn't feel the weight of his praise. There was too much unfinished business, too many loose ends that threatened to unravel everything they'd fought for. As Marcus walked away to oversee the rest of the operation, Layla turned her gaze back toward the water, her reflection rippling faintly in the dark waves. She couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's victory was hollow, a fleeting reprieve in a fight that seemed endless. The drive home was quiet, the city's lights blurring past as Layla replayed the night's events in her mind. Every decision, every action, every word from Torres echoed in her thoughts, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. She had chosen this life, knowing the toll it would take, but that didn't make it any easier. The line between justice and futility often felt razor-thin, and tonight was no exception. When she finally reached her apartment, the silence was deafening. The familiar surroundings felt foreign, as though the chaos of the night had followed her home, refusing to let her rest. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the floor, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The image of Torres's smug expression, his chilling words of defiance, played on a loop in her mind. You think this ends here? Layla clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. No, it didn't end here. It wouldn't end until every piece of the cartel's operation was dismantled, until every victim of their greed and violence could find peace. She had chosen this fight, and she wouldn't back down now. The next morning, Layla arrived at the DEA field office, her fatigue hidden beneath a mask of determination. The debriefing was thorough, every detail of the operation dissected and analyzed. There was praise for her quick thinking, for salvaging the mission when it seemed doomed to fail. But there was also a stark acknowledgement of the challenges that lay ahead. Torres was in custody, but the cartel's retaliation was inevitable. Their networks would adapt, their methods evolve. Layla's work was far from over, and she knew it. As the meeting concluded, Marcus pulled her aside. "You sure you're up for what comes next?" he asked, his concern evident. Layla met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "I didn't come this far to quit now." Marcus nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious demeanor. "Good, because this fight isn't over. But with you leading the charge, we might just have a shot." As Layla left the office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and unforgiving, but she was ready for it. She had faced worse and come out stronger. The cartel might think they could outlast her, but they were wrong. Layla Harris wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting to prove that even in the darkest corners of the world, there was still a light worth protecting. And she wouldn't stop until it burned brighter than ever.